In 2025, decades after leaving the boxing spotlight, Prince Naseem Hamed lives in near-total isolation in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Sheffield. The world remembers the swagger, the theatrics, the meteoric rise, and the sudden, unexplained fade. But when investigators receive rare permission to explore his private estate for a legacy documentary, they discover rooms untouched since his prime, and spaces he never intended anyone to enter. What they find doesn't reveal the prince. It reveals the man he tried to bury. The gates to Prince Naseem Hamed's Sheffield estate opened with a slow hydraulic hiss, revealing a mansion far different from what investigators expected. For a man whose entrances once shook arenas and whose personality once bent the energy of entire crowds, the property felt unnervingly mute. The grass was overgrown in uniform patches, as though trimmed by neglect rather than randomness. The windows were tinted black from the inside, swallowing sunlight instead of reflecting it. Even the exterior walls, once rumored to be adorned with gold accents during his peak years, had been repainted a dull, uniform gray, an intentional erasure of flamboyance. Inside, the silence was so thick it felt engineered. Every step the investigators took produced no echo. The walls were coated with dense acoustic insulation, usually reserved for sound labs or panic rooms. There were no framed career photos, no championship belts, no murals of the prince's iconic entrances. In fact, the only trace of his past lay beneath a thin layer of matte black paint on the foyer wall, a faint silhouette of a once vibrant mural showing him mid-celebration. He hadn't removed it. He had buried it under a single decisive coat. Down the central hallway, dim floor lights flickered to life as motion sensors activated. The lights flashed in rhythmic intervals, quick, sharp beats echoing the exact pace of the footwork drills he used in his prime. This was not coincidence. Someone calibrated the lights to mimic his boxing rhythm, as though the house still moved to the silent memory of his prime-time cadence. At the end of the hallway, a metal door stood slightly ajar, marked only with a small brass plate etched with a feather, the symbol he once wore into the ring. But the feather was tarnished, bent down the center, its edges scratched, as if someone had attempted to remove it and failed midway. The investigators exchanged glances. Everything in the house felt like a contradiction. A man famous for spectacle living inside a structure built to suppress even the faintest expression of identity. Then, a draft of cold air whispered from behind the metal door. Something deeper waited inside. Something not meant for visitors, maybe not even for the prince himself anymore. What lay beyond wasn't a tribute to the champion. It was the beginning of an autopsy of the man he used to be. When the metal door was pushed open, the investigators stepped into a chamber that immediately activated a wave of distant, warbling sound. At first, it was almost indistinguishable, a faint hum, like an arena heard underwater. But within seconds, the noise built into a layered roar, the unmistakable sound of crowds chanting, cheering, screaming, stamping, except something was wrong. The audio was distorted, the pitch fluctuating unpredictably, as if the recordings had been stretched and twisted until enthusiasm became anxiety. Dozens of directional speakers had been installed along the walls, angled in chaotic patterns that forced the sound to collide and overlap. Instead of evoking the electric excitement of Naseem's legendary entrances, the room produced a claustrophobic simulation of fame turned hostile. As the roar intensified, projectors flickered to life, casting hazy images across the walls. The prince, cartwheeling into the ring, leaping over ropes, shadowboxing under fireworks. But each projection cut abruptly before the first punch was thrown, dissolving into static like a memory refusing to fully surface. The investigators noted how carefully the chamber was engineered. The speakers were calibrated with acoustic mapping technology, capable of replicating arena reverberations at precise decibel points. Someone had painstakingly reconstructed the sound of fame, but not its glory, its weight. Hidden behind one panel, audio logs revealed different versions of crowd noise: boos, jeers, chants of his name in exaltation, and even mixed reactions from specific fights. Each file was shorter than it should have been, clipped, looped, repeated, an endless cycle of adoration turning into pressure. But the most jarring element was a lone speaker in the corner that operated independently from the others. Its output wasn't crowd noise, it was a whisper, a soft, rhythmic phrase repeating with eerie consistency. They cheer what they don't understand. They cheer what they don't understand. The investigators realized this wasn't nostalgia, it was confrontation. A man revisiting the roar that carried him skyward, then drowned him. A hidden sensor light flickered near the far wall, illuminating a series of faint cracks outlining a narrow doorway. Whatever was behind that doorway wasn't built to be heard. It was built to be carried. Beyond the narrow doorway stretched a long, dimly lit chamber, lined with an unsettling array of weighing scales. Dozens of them, from analog relics of the early 90s to modern digital models, stood in perfect rows like silent judges. Each scale bore a small metal tag, engraved with dates corresponding to Naseem's major fights. Some scales were locked at precise numbers: 122 pounds, 126 pounds, 127.5 after the failed rehydration attempts. Others lay shattered, their glass faces spiderwebbed, their needles frozen mid-tension as if struck by force. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single overhead beam, stood a tall wooden pedestal holding a large leather-bound journal. As investigators opened it, they discovered a meticulous record of every weigh-in from the prince's career. Each entry contained not only the numbers, but short personal notes, some triumphant, some frustrated, some cryptic. Many pages described how effortless the weight cuts once felt, how the speed and flair came naturally, until one day they didn't. One entry read, "The real weight isn't on the scale. It's the version of myself they expect to see after it." On the far wall, a more haunting installation dominated the room, a massive mural made of overlapping fight posters. Instead of showing the opponents, every face except Naseem's had been torn away. His own image was intact, but dimmed, yellowed, covered with fingerprints. Above the mural, carved deeply into the plaster, were the words, "Explosiveness fades, expectation doesn't." The investigators noticed marks on the floor, patterns of pacing, circles worn into the wood. Someone had spent hours here, stepping onto one scale, then another, repeating the ritual long after retirement. The room wasn't about physical weight, it was about the crushing gravity of a legend. Then a faint metallic clang echoed from beneath the scales. As they looked closer, they found a recessed handle, hidden under one of the heaviest analog platforms. Pulling it revealed a stairway descending into darkness. Where the upper floors confronted fame, the lower level promised something deeper. The parts of his story no camera ever captured and no crowd ever saw. The staircase from the weight chamber ended at a reinforced fire door painted the same dull gray as the rest of the house. But unlike the others, this one had no handle on the outside, only a groove where fingers had repeatedly pried it open from within. When the investigators forced it back, they stepped into a corridor that looked like the inside of a newspaper archive and a crime scene at the same time. Every inch of the walls was covered in framed headlines. Not just boxing reports, judgment, grainy photos of a young Naseem grinning at weigh-ins, shots of him taunting opponents, hands low, chin up, dancing, grinning. At first glance, it was a hall of fame, but every frame had been altered. Some headlines were slashed with red ink, others burned along the edges. Quotes from pundits and promoters had been underlined, crossed out, annotated with small, furious handwriting. Too arrogant for his own good. Greatness wasted. The fall of Prince Naseem. Under them, in his script, arrogant or free, wasted or finished on my own terms. Further down the hall, the tone darkened. Clippings chronicled the long layoff after the Barrera loss, the criticisms that he never came back the same, speculation that his heart was gone. Then, the non-boxing controversies, the reckless driving case face, the crash, the public condemnation, the image of a former champion in a courtroom instead of a ring. On those frames, the glass was cracked from the inside. It looked as if someone had punched them and then carefully re-hung them as evidence. In the center of the corridor hung one oversized photograph. Naseem stood mid-ring walk, arms wide, robe glittering, smirking at the cameras. The crowd behind him was a blur. This time, his face was untouched. Instead, every visible face in the crowd had been scratched out, leaving behind a field of faceless bodies surrounding a perfectly clear Prince. Beneath the photograph, a simple brass plate was screwed into the wall. "They made me the villain. I made sure they were right." The corridor wasn't designed to defend him. It was designed to record exactly how he had been seen, and the cost of never correcting the narrative. At the far end, a steel door waited, heavier than anything above. Embossed into the metal were his iconic ring walk wings. Only here, both wings were cracked straight through the middle, held together by welded seams like a broken bone reset too late. Behind that door, there would be no headlines, only the moment the performer stopped performing. The winged door opened into a room that felt like a replica of the life he walked away from, and a grave for it at the same time. In the center sat a small boxing ring, no larger than the ones used in youth clubs. The ropes sagged, their once bright colors faded into a tired, sickly hue. The canvas, stained in irregular patterns, held no fresh marks, only layered shadows of long-dried sweat and chalk. On the floor around the ring, faded tape lines marked footwork drills, lateral steps, pivots, angles. The patterns were complex, almost choreographed, echoes of the unorthodox movement that made him untouchable in his prime. Yet the tape was peeling, curling at the edges, like a ghost of speed that never returned. Heavy bags hung in the corners, but only one showed real damage. It was split open along its side, stuffing spilling out like a ruptured organ. Repeated impact marks surrounded the tear, closer together than any normal combination. It didn't look like structured training. It looked like someone trying to punch through something that wouldn't give way. A projector, mounted on an exposed beam, flickered silently to life when the motion sensors caught movement. On the opposite wall, it cast footage from the Marco Antonio Barrera fight, but the projection always stopped in the same place. The walk from the corner to the center of the ring in round one, the touch of gloves, the first failed slip. As soon as the opening exchanges began, the image glitched, distorted, and snapped back to the walk-in again. It played on a loop: approach, expectation, cut, approach, expectation, cut. The fight itself had been surgically removed, leaving only the moment before reality altered the myth. On a worn wooden bench by the ropes lay a pair of hand wraps, still rolled but stained and stiff from long-dried sweat. They were positioned side by side, as if set down mid-routine and never picked up again. Next to them, a small lockbox rested half-tucked under the ring apron, its surface scratched by repeated handling. Inside, investigators found cassette tapes labeled by date and opponent, not of actual bouts, but of imagined ones, recordings of Naseem talking through how the fight should go, round by round, predicting knockouts, taunts, celebrations. The dates continued after his final professional fight, as if he kept planning comebacks that never reached the ring. The last tape bore no opponent name, only 3 words: "What I couldn't say." And beneath the ring, hidden in the shadows, a square cut in the floor suggested that this was not the bottom. There was still one more layer below, the place where he stopped talking to cameras and started talking only to himself. The cutout section beneath the ring concealed a recessed handle, cold to the touch. When pulled, a square panel lifted to reveal a ladder disappearing into darkness. The air from below smelled of dust, old paper, and something metallic, like the inside of a safe that had been sealed for years. This wasn't another training room. It felt like an archive. At the bottom of the ladder, investigators found a narrow corridor leading to a heavy vault door fitted with a mechanical lock, not an electronic one. The numbers on the dial were worn, evidence of frequent use by the same hands. Once opened, the door swung inward with a low groan, exposing a chamber lined with drawers, shelves, and stacked boxes, each labeled with years instead of contents. This was not a trophy room. It was a confession vault. Keys from the lockbox upstairs matched small brass tags on the drawers. Inside the 1995 to 1997 drawer were handwritten letters, some addressed to family, some to trainers, some to no one. The early entries brimmed with belief, declarations about destiny, invincibility, divine purpose. As the years progressed, the tone shifted. The 1999 to 2000 folder contained pages of self-critique, lines about distraction, ego, conflict between faith and fame. The drawer marked 2001 to 2002 was denser, crammed with notes full of doubt. If I lose, do I disappear? Or do I finally get to be human? They want the prince, not me. So who am I when they stop asking? On one shelf, neatly arranged tapes sat in chronological order. Unlike the bravado-filled predictions above, these recordings were quieter. In several, his voice wavered as he reflected on the Barrera loss, not with excuses, but with an almost clinical breakdown of how his timing, sharpness, and hunger had shifted. In others, he spoke about the car crash, about being seen not as a champion anymore, but as a headline. One tape ended with a paused, pained silence before he whispered, "I built a character the world adored, and I let him eat the man underneath." In the back corner of the vault, a single sealed envelope lay under a paperweight shaped like a miniature crown. On the front, written in careful script, "Open only when all else is understood." Inside wasn't a confession. It was a sentence. "I didn't retire because I was finished fighting. I retired because I was finished being watched." The vault did not absolve him. It didn't justify his choices or rewrite the controversies. It simply held the parts of his story that never made it to interviews, press conferences, or documentaries. And yet, even here, the story wasn't complete. Because somewhere deeper in the house, he didn't just store memories of who he had been. He preserved the costumes of who he had pretended to be. Past the vault of silence, a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for two people, twisted toward a faint orange glow. The walls here were different, textured, almost organic, like layers of old fabric pressed together. The corridor opened suddenly into a chamber unlike any other in the mansion. At first glance, it resembled a museum exhibit dedicated to his flamboyant entrances. But the longer the investigators looked, the more it resembled a mausoleum. Suspended in glass cases along the walls were the costumes that defined Prince Naseem's theatrical style. The feathered robes, the jeweled jackets, the embroidered capes that shimmered under arena lights. But time had altered them. Some feathers were singed, blackened at the tips as if held too close to fire. Others had been slashed with surgical precision, cut only through the wings or chest area, as though dissecting the very symbolism of dominance and bravado. Every case was temperature-controlled, set to a perpetual coolness meant to preserve delicate fabric. Yet several cases had condensation streaks inside, evidence someone had opened them repeatedly, touching the items, maybe even wearing them again in moments of nostalgia or longing. In the center of the room stood a full-length mirror, its surface spider-webbed with a single vertical crack splitting the reflection in two. Across the cracked glass, written in black permanent marker, were the words, "Showmanship is a shield, but who protects the shield?" Behind the mirror, faint fingerprints smudged the edges, indicating countless moments where he had braced himself against his own reflection. The investigators surveyed the floor and found small piles of feathers scattered around the base of the cases, as though bits of his past had broken loose and fallen over time. One display featured a video screen looping his ring walks, the dancing, the flips, the feathered robes sweeping behind him like wings. But every time the footage reached the peak of his confidence, arms outstretched, chin lifted, the screen flickered to black for a split second, almost like an involuntary blink before resuming. The glitch repeated endlessly, turning swagger into stutter. On the far wall, a framed blueprint showed costume designs never used. Some were extravagant, others bizarrely subdued. Robes devoid of feathers, meant more for farewell than spectacle. Beside the blueprint, lay a handwritten note. "I knew the prince would die long before the man, but I didn't know how to bury him." As the investigators approached the exit, a gust of chilled air rippled through the room, stirring loose feathers across the floor. One feather drifted into a narrow crack in the wall, revealing a hidden seam. Another concealed passage waited, and this one led not to spectacle, but to silence. The silence he lived in after the world stopped chanting his name. The hidden passage opened into a windowless chamber, larger than expected, yet suffocatingly empty. No decorations, no equipment, no sound. The walls were thickly padded with soundproof foam, arranged not in perfect squares, but in mismatched patterns that created a disorienting visual rhythm. The investigators realized that this wasn't a professional sound room. It was a personal one, constructed gradually, almost ritualistically. In the center of the room stood a single wooden stool. Its legs were uneven, worn down by restless motion, its seat polished by repeated use. Around the stool, faint indentations marred the foam where knuckles had struck the wall. There were hundreds of these marks, small, deep, irregular. They weren't training impacts. They were expressions, silent ones. Microphones embedded in the ceiling indicated the room wasn't meant to silence everything. It was meant to capture something specific. A recorder hidden behind a panel contained audio logs spanning years. The investigators played the first file. What emerged wasn't speech, just breathing. Long stretches of inhaling and exhaling. Steady, then trembling, then steady again. Only many minutes later did his voice appear. "They forgot the prince." Another file began with a bitter laugh. "Maybe that's good." A third, quieter. "Maybe that's peace." Some recordings captured phrases of prayer, others fragments of regret, and a few were simply silence held for so long the microphone began to hum. It became clear that this chamber wasn't an escape. It was a confessional booth with no priest on the other side. A place where the man could exist without the persona. On the floor near the far wall, investigators found a circle of tape marking what must have been a habitual standing point. The floor beneath was worn smooth, as though he had stood there for years delivering invisible monologues to an audience that no longer existed. But the most chilling element lay in the back of the chamber, a trap door embedded seamlessly into the floor, perfectly camouflaged beneath a layer of soundproof padding. The edges were finger-worn, hinting at repeated use. The investigators hesitated, understanding instinctively that whatever lay beneath this room would not be a continuation of reflection, but a conclusion to it. Because the chamber of silence was where he spoke the truth to himself. The final chamber would reveal the truth he hid from everyone else. Beneath the trapdoor, a ladder descended into near darkness. A faint smell of old film reels and stale air drifted upward, the scent of forgotten media. At the bottom lay a circular chamber with smooth concrete walls, illuminated only by a single hanging bulb swaying gently, as though disturbed by motion, long before the investigators arrived. In the center of the room stood a metal pedestal supporting an old VHS camcorder, dusty, dented, yet plugged into a small portable monitor. A strip of masking tape across the camera body read, "My Real Last Fight." Beside the camcorder sat a stack of tapes, each labeled, but most labels torn away. Only one remained intact. The investigators inserted it. Static crackled, then cleared into an image of Prince Naseem Hamed sitting alone in this same chamber, years younger but already burdened by the weight of silence. No costume, no feathers, no swagger. Just a man hunched forward, elbows on knees, staring directly into the lens. He began speaking softly, almost reluctantly. "Everyone remembers the prince," he said, "but no one remembers the boy who became him." He talked about the intoxicating nature of confidence, how it became a performance that consumed him. He described the Barrera fight not as defeat, but as revelation. "For the first time, the prince didn't walk out before me, and without him, I didn't know who I was." He reflected on the years of criticism, the controversies, the car crash, each event layered not as a fall from grace, but as evidence that the character he built had become too heavy to carry. Midway through the recording, he paused and looked away from the camera, as though listening to someone unseen. His eyes welled, but he forced a smile, small, tired, honest. The prince didn't retire. he whispered. He just stopped showing up. As the tape neared its end, the audio crackled with the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, yet not matching Naseem's breathing. He looked up sharply, startled, then leaned closer to the lens. "If you found this room," a long exhale, "then you know the truth. I didn't disappear from boxing. I disappeared from the version of me that boxing required." The screen went black, but the audio continued. A second voice, soft, younger, eerily similar, whispered from somewhere inside the chamber. "I'm still here." The investigators froze. The camcorder powered down. The tape ejected itself. The bulb above flickered once, then twice, before steadying again. They reported hearing footsteps behind them, though no one else was recorded entering or leaving. The final archive held no physical trophies, no belts, no photos. It held the last known conversation between the man and the persona, the fighter and the boy, the prince and the human beneath him. And when the investigators sealed the house behind them, they wrote only one line in their final entry. Prince Naseem Hamed didn't retire from the sport. He retired from being a myth.